Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin the formal proceedings, I've just been asked to mention the rule on mobile phones. Please silence them, and if there is an emergency, those towards the front, please notice that there is an exit there on your left. First Minister, Ambassador, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Provost and on behalf of Trinity's new research institute, the Long Room Hub. Now, this public theatre is an historic setting and traditionally a place of spectacle. It's most appropriate for what is undoubtedly an historic occasion this evening. We're meeting in this great 18th century hall, watched from the canvases overhead by men who made and unmade parliaments, and of course by a woman who fought with Parliament, created this university, and a little while earlier had found it necessary to sign the death warrant of a Queen of Scotland. That was a long time ago, and our concerns today are very different. It's a different Scotland and a different Ireland. There are, however, two things in the recent past that I would like to briefly mention: a process and an event. The process has been the slow, steady, and I hope inexorable build-up of links between Irish and Scottish universities, particularly in the humanities disciplines of Celtic studies, history, and English, over the last 30 years. And this process has been strongly championed by Trinity, as well as by Queen's Belfast, University of Ulster, St Andrews, Strathclyde, Edinburgh, and last but certainly not least, Aberdeen. A host of projects and collaborations have grown out of this process, which have, along the way, explored Irish-Scottish links and connections over the centuries, from religious colonisation to sporting colonisation. They've weighed up the contrasts between Scotland and Ireland over the last millennium, and our golden ages have rarely coincided so far. And the projects have sought to identify the parallels in our national stories and to ponder on them. It's been a hugely productive engagement with great future potential. That's the process. The event that I think we should recall was a visit to Trinity at the end of September 2000 by the then first Scottish First Minister, the First Minister under devolution, the late Donald Dewar. He gave his only public address in Ireland on that occasion here in Trinity to an audience almost as large as ours this evening. It was a memorable speech arguing the case for the integrity of Anglo-Scottish union in the wake of devolution. We've had to wait almost 8 years for what I'm sure will be a very different take on devolution and an alternative future for Scotland to that suggested by Donald Dewar. Now, we've, of course, reached a very different point in the modern history of Scotland. With the formation of the Scottish National Party-led government in May 2007, the First Minister has been setting out a radically new vision of Scotland in the 21st century and of its relationship not just with London and Brussels, but with Ireland North and Ireland South. The First Minister, an economist and historian by training, and for many years an oil industry analyst in the Royal Bank of Scotland, has more than 20 years' experience in parliamentary life, having served as an MP in Westminster and as an MSP in Scotland, in Edinburgh, before leading the SNP to the commanding heights of power after last year's Scottish election. And since that time, he's greatly raised the profile of Scotland internationally, not least in Washington and also in Belfast. And now we are delighted, sir, to have you in Dublin, and truly privileged to receive you at such a seminal moment as I think this is. So it's with great pleasure that I now invite the Right Honourable Alex Salmond to address us on Scotland's national conversation, Next Steps.
Well, Chair and friends, I'm absolutely honoured and privileged that you should invite me here to Trinity during Sexual Health Week. I was asked by our hosts if I had seen the banner shag and I said, yeah, absolutely. I was trying desperately not to be photographed underneath it. Scottish press are very bad that way, you know. And I was delighted to receive a love pack for St. Valentine's Day. I was kind of disappointed to find this was a general thing and wasn't specific to me, but nonetheless, I was delighted to receive that as well. This I regard as a great honour, almost as great an honour as seeing the Book of Kells and the early Scottish chroniclers. It certainly made my blood race as I come to Trinity. Incidentally, we are in friendly competition just now for a film about Mary Queen of Scots, whose head was so unjustly and cruelly severed from her fair body. Robert Burns once described her in a visit to the Livgo Palace. Livgo's my hometown. I wasn't born in the palace like Mary Queen of Scots, but nonetheless it's my hometown. And Robert Burns once described his visit to the palace. He'd actually come to the Livgo to be inculcated into the Masonic Lodge, to be proclaimed Scotia's Bard. But if you read his journal, his diary, all he can talk about is Mary Queen of Scots, where it describes, has shown the room where the beautiful injured Mary Queen of Scots was born. Burns was obviously having a love affair, 150 years after the event with Mary Queen of Scots. The interesting thing about the diary entry, and it's well worth a look at, is, of course, like all great people, Burns had the ability to look beyond his own experience. I mean, Robert Burns was a Presbyterian, albeit a wayward one, but when he came to Linlithgow, what he didn't write about was being inculcated into the Masonic Lodge, being proclaimed Scotia's Bard. He wrote about Scotland's beautiful, injured, lost Catholic Queen, and a passage well worth looking at. So I come to Trinity as a friend of Ireland. I've always come as a friend of Ireland. I was sent to Dublin, dispatched to Dublin first more than 20 years ago by the Royal Bank of Scotland when I was earning a bare crust as an economist in the financial sector. It was before Big Bang. We got paid next to nothing in these days. and I was sent to have a look at to see if there was anything in the emerging Irish financial district. Now I am, and always have been, a friend of Ireland. However, I wasn't too optimistic. I thought, well, maybe a few building societies here and there. I hope to God they've destroyed that report I wrote. And like many things in Ireland over these last 20 years, the Irish financial district and the banks of the Liffey has been a profound and wonderful success, a testimony to the vision of those who established it. Some years later, probably 10 years later, in the north of Ireland, I was asked to make a speech at the John Hewitt Summer School during the first peace process. And I was instructed that John Hewitt Summer School that year at Carnlough was set up to provide a forum by which all the non-Irish parties could meet for one of the first times in the same room together. And what was to happen, I was to make a speech and then they were to all ask me a question. And I was given absolutely strict instructions that no matter what, I was to be as moderate, as consensual, as amenable as I possibly could be. And the whole thing went wonderfully well. I mean, I made a speech about Scotland and Ireland, about Dalriada, about Irish culture, Irish history, Scottish history, interreaction between Scotland and Ulster, all sorts of things. I missed out all the unpleasant bits, and I made a wonderful speech saying that, the history had been marvellous, and togetherness and all the rest of it. I thought I'd done rather well, actually, and the whole thing went very well. It was kind of interrupted when one of David Irvin's pals was arrested for gun running in Glasgow that afternoon, but nonetheless, that by and large, the press thought this was great. Everybody was in the room together. At the end of the speech, a lady came up to me who introduced herself as Liam Neeson's auntie. At that time, Rob Roy was a Vogue film, and Liam Neeson had just starred in it. And she said to me, she said, Mr. Salmond, she said, that speech was so wonderful. It was so moderate and reasonable. If only our politicians in Northern Ireland could speak like that. And I didn't have the heart to tell Liam Neeson's auntie that I was on my best behaviour, and I'm not like that at all. So if she's in the audience tonight, then, you know, this is the real me now. Not long after that, I was doing a speech at the Humber Summer School. And maybe I'll take this as my starting point. And it was at a time where Ireland was considering membership of the emerging euro. The European Financial Authority had been established under Lamfalussy. And like all countries, Ireland was considering its options as the idea of a European currency emerged. And Irish summer schools are wonderful things. I mean, they really are a varied and entertaining combination of the arts and literature and politics, and economists get let in occasionally as well. But by and large, most of the people are pretty interesting. And this was no exception. And this Humber Summer School was giving Peter Sutherland, who was advocating euro entry, a very tough time. And he was in for a real roasting about whether surrendering the currency was surrendering the essence of independence. I also remember his phrase, which calmed the seas, it calmed the waters. He said, let's just start from the assumption that everyone in this room is an Irish nationalist. And with that phrase, he drew the sting out of an audience which was set to give him a rough time on the exact definitions of sovereignty. So in starting this, let me just assume that everyone in this room is an Irish nationalist. And there's one or two people in it who are Scottish nationalists as well. And let's proceed, unlike my former colleague and the late Donald Dewar, from a slightly different perspective about the future of Scotland. So I'm delighted to be here in Trinity. It's my first visit to Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, as Scotland's First Minister. I hope and believe it will be the first of many. I'm not sure how closely most of you have followed what's happening in Scottish politics over the last week, for example. It's been, as they say in the Chinese curse, it's interesting times in Scottish politics. Last week was, well, all weeks are interesting when you lead a minority government, but last week was an absolute belter. We were facing a crucial vote in our first budget, something which was said they would never, ever get through a parliament as a minority government. And I've very generously offered to tender my resignation as First Minister if the budget wasn't passed. It wasn't so much an ultimatum, it was more a kind of offer to everyone else. And indeed, had the votes in the chamber last Wednesday had gone differently, my next visit to Ireland would have not been to represent Scotland tomorrow at the British Irish Ministerial Council, but to support Scotland in the Six Nations at Croke Park at the weekend. In the event, the opposition parties declined my offer, and the first minority administration, the first SNP administration in the Scots Parliament succeeded in passing our first budget by 64 votes to 1, with 60 abstentions. It reminded me of the old story about an ex-provost of Glasgow Council who was lying ill, terminally ill in hospital, and received a note that the council meeting had discussed his condition and had decided to send him their very best wishes for a full recovery by 61 votes to 60 with 5 abstentions. Well, with the resounding triumph of 64 votes to 1 with 60 abstentions, the good ship, of course, that you probably have realised why our political opponents didn't want another election. And you probably realised why I did want another election. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability under the rules of the Scottish Parliament to dissolve Parliament as my former colleague Gordon Brown does for the UK Parliament. Otherwise, I probably would be thinking about doing that sometime very, very soon. But passing the budget was a big step forward for politics in Scotland. With new investment in health and education, more police in the streets, tax cuts for business and new measures on the environment, it was a budget to benefit all the people of Scotland. And that is within the confines of the poorest spending settlement for Westminster for a generation. So I am proud to be able to speak to you today about the changes underway in Scottish society. The inspiration and lessons that I like to draw from the enormous success in Ireland's economy and society, and a bit about the growing debate about Scotland's future. I know that, because I read the Irish press pretty constantly, and it's very interesting, as often you do in politics, that when you're within what is an extraordinary period of economic and social advance in Ireland, then people understandably, because they're close to the issue, see all sorts of things which are faults and failings within the system, things that could be done better. And long may that continue, incidentally, because that's the very essence of democratic politics. What you understand, however, is when we look from the outside and we see the transformation of Ireland in the last 20 years, those of us who've known it over these years, we celebrate a quite extraordinary collective national achievement. And we draw inspiration from the progress that Ireland has made. And as a nation in Scotland, we tend to look outwards and upwards. We must measure ourselves against those around us and against and with those who have the ambition to achieve. So I like to talk often about the arc of prosperity which surrounds Scotland in the northwest corner of Europe. Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Denmark, they're all small, they're all independent nations, they're all stable, they're all secure, they're all prosperous. And of all these nations, no example is more impressive and more inspiring than Ireland, and none, of course, is more relevant to the decisions that Scotland now faces. So I've come to Dublin to set out our aspirations for Scotland's future, to say a bit how we'll create a Celtic line economy in Scotland to match, and who knows, perhaps surpass, the Celtic tiger on this side of the Irish Sea, and how, in particular, to achieve this ambition, we must fashion a strong and enduring social partnership to match that which you have built in Ireland. Because Ireland pioneered the social partnership model that reaches out beyond government, beyond business, beyond the trade unions, to draw in civic institutions, social enterprise, the universities, and others. That partnership laid the foundations for 2 decades of unrivaled economic progress in Ireland by your own standards and by any global standard. And a partnership approach rightly remains the basis for future cooperation and economic success in this country. So my government in Scotland is doing its utmost to bring together a broad coalition of the major institutions in Scottish society, including business, including the trade unions, the voluntary sector, academia, to deliver our social partnership. And we work with a shared purpose, a rich economy and a rich society. And I should say, at this stage, I'm encouraged by the level of commitment and optimism and enthusiasm from all sides. I made a film about the Celtic tiger. It was a wee while ago. It was when the television companies in Scotland still made films, so it was about 12 years ago. And I remember interviewing Rory Quinn, who was the Irish finance minister at the time, and asking him about the progress that Ireland was making. And it was Rory Quinn, I think, who actually coined the phrase that Ireland was a rich economy but not yet a rich society, which impressed me greatly. But what impressed me even more was the answer to one of the questions I asked him at that time. I asked him something like, and this shows I'm probably better at answering. I'll never rival Jeremy Paxman, let's put it that way. I said something like, Finance Minister, to what do you attribute your economic success? Now, it was a pretty mundane question. The answer was magnificent. What he said was, 15 years ago, the Irish parties, ourselves, he was a Labour politician, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, came together in an educational convention, and we recognised that Ireland was an under-educated society, and we recognised that if we were to achieve what we wanted to achieve, then we would have to, at a time of great stringency, divert resources into education in Ireland. And we knew if we did that, that many of the young people who were educated, who had that opportunity, would go elsewhere to seek their employment, to seek their advantage. But we also knew if we got the competitive conditions right in the Irish economy, that they would come back again. And what has happened to Ireland, said Rory Quinn, is they are returning. Now, I remember that answer as if it was yesterday, and I remember it for this very explicit reason. I fell among thieves by which I mean the Westminster Parliament, not the Scottish National Party, some 20 years ago. And I've knocked about some great people, some pretty dodgy people, and some people whose vision was extended to, if they were lucky, the next morning. And one of the great habits and enduring faults in politicians, myself included often, is basic short-termism. If, for example, we asked, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the present Prime Minister Gordon Brown, to what do you attribute the success of the UK economy, Chancellor? Then without any question, Gordon would have pointed to the wheeze in his last budget or to independence for the Bank of England or some other aspect. It was profoundly impressive to hear an Irish finance minister, who I think then was chair of ECOFIN, who attributed economic success to a long-term decision made collectively as a society across the political parties to divert resources into education in recognition that human capital was the foundation of economic success. Profoundly impressive. So the partnership and inspiration that we look for is forged not simply just about economics. The institutions that I've mentioned, the trade unions, the voluntary sector, the churches, are the cornerstones of Scotland's civic life and define us as a society. In fact, it's thanks to these distinctive Scottish institutions, the universities, the churches, the legal system, that we have retained a strong and aspirant nationhood in Scotland during the 3 centuries that we have been part of the United Kingdom. So when in August last year my government published its white paper, Choosing Scotland's Future, we turned to the words of Charles Stewart Parnell to summarise our essential message. Now, Parnell's statue stands on O'Connell Street, less than a mile from this building, and it's a fitting monument to one of the greatest men in the 19th century, indeed any century, because it was Parnell who, in the words of Gladstone, had set the Home Rule argument on its legs. And to this day, Parnell's words resonate strongly with the movement of Scottish nationalism. And what we have in the foreword to the white paper is the quote, "No man has the right to fix the boundary on a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, thus far shalt thou go and no further." It's a quote I've always liked, and it's a quote that I felt I was due to put on the first white paper from the first SNP government, the first government document in Scotland for 300 years, which proclaimed the virtues of Scottish independence, for a number of reasons. This is it here, this is the Choosing Future, and here we have the quote from Parnell. I felt I owed Charles Stewart Parnell a debt, because in 1987, when I became the Member of Parliament for Bamford-Buchan, I was determined to show off in the Commons chamber. It's a fault I have occasionally. And I wanted to make my first speech in the Commons with no notes whatsoever. It was to climax with that quote from Parnell. So anyway, I made the speech and I had no notes, and it all went very well, but I totally forgot the quote. I don't mean I forgot what the quote was, I just forgot to deliver it. I climaxed the speech with no quote. But nobody noticed, because nobody knew what was in my speech. But before I'd spoken, a guy called James Kilfidder, who was the leader of the United Ulster Unionist Unity Party, the 4 UPs. It was a one-person party, and he was totally united. And Jim had made a speech from the government then, the Tory benches, which was really friendly towards Scotland. It was, because the Tories had lost half their seats in the 1987 general election of Scotland. And Jim spoke passionately about how he'd warned the government to keep their eye on Scotland, how they'd insulted the Scottish nation, how they'd paid the price. So as is kind of the tradition in the Commons, we went for a drink afterwards, because I'd made my maiden speech. And I said, look, Jim, I said, you know, you were so nice about Scotland that I was going to climax my speech with a quote from Charles Stewart Parnell. But given your generosity towards Scotland, I missed it out. And Kilfidder said to me, he said, you shouldn't have bothered, Alec. Parnell was a good Protestant, laid low by the machinations of the Catholic Church. So I felt that I owed Charles Stewart Parnell that quote on the white paper, Choosing Scotland's Future, the first government document for 300 years in Scotland extolling the virtues of independence and nationhood. The road to Irish independence was long, steep, far from straight. But having made this momentous journey, no one in this university, no one in this country, I suspect, would want to reverse that process. Now, Scotland has a different history, a different constitution. Scotland isn't Ireland, Ireland isn't Scotland. But our aspirations for our nation are no different from those which inspired generations of Irish people to independence and the prosperity that's enjoyed by this country today. Now, tomorrow at the British Irish Council, I meet the Taoiseach, Bertie Ahern, Dr. Ian Paisley, Martin McGuinness, Roger Morgan, Paul Murphy, the Chief Ministers of Guernsey, Jersey, the Isle of Man. And the last meeting of the Council was in Belfast, which was a historic occasion, coming just after the resumption of the political institutions of Northern Ireland. The first meeting of the Council that I attended last June was very memorable. And what struck me, even among fellow politicians, was the commonality between us. There were shared ideas, values, humour, cultural understanding, despite the political diversity. Indeed, at that meeting, because Roger Morgan was off ill, the Prime Minister, that's Gordon Brown, and Sean Woodward, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, were actually the only Labour Party politicians present in the room. There was about 20 politicians representing the various countries and islands and states and devolved bits around the islands. But there was only 2 politicians of the dominant political party in London. And actually Sean started his career as a Tory, parliamentary career as a Tory politician, you might remember. So arguably there was only one. And even that's subject to argument now. But the shared interest and the commonality should not be a surprise. Our nations, these areas, these countries, these islands, grew from the same soil, from the same name, of course. As Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, Ireland was known by its Latin name, Scotia, and the people known as the Scotai. And of course that was illustrated to me when I saw the Book of Kells a few minutes ago. I was told that the vile rumour that the Book of Kells was written in Northumbria has now been thoroughly put to rest in historical terms. And I'm delighted about that, because I know for a fact it was written in Paisley. I mean, it's but it does make the point that you cannot consider the history of the island of Ireland without looking at Scotland's influence. And you cannot begin to understand even modern Scottish society without looking at our deep Irish roots. At close quarters with each other, the similarities are striking. If you look abroad, it's almost a mirror image. Because for the peoples of 2 small Atlantic nations, the Scots and Irish have left broad and unmistakable tracks across much of the world. Not only are the Scots and the Irish welcomed across the globe, the affection and the admiration for our nations runs deeper. It's so deep that tens of millions of citizens in the United States, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand are proud to trace their ancestry back to our 2 nations. Across the world, over 80 million people, that's more than 1 in every 100, lays claim to being Irish. 45 million regard themselves as Scots. Indeed, the 2000 census in the United States of America identified 5 million Americans with Scottish roots. Yet a survey conducted at the same time said that 21 million people in the United States claim Scottish ancestry. I've always thought that's the most wonderful compliment to Scotland. You know, there's 60 million people knocking about the continental United States who claim to be Scottish, even though in reality there is a limited Scottish ancestry. But the point is a substantial one. The size and impact of both the Scottish and Irish diasporas is astonishing. If you take just one aspect, the remarkable number of American presidents with Irish and Scottish roots, In March 2001, at the launch of the Irish American Heritage Month, the White House announced that 19, that's nearly half, of all US presidents claimed Irish origin. And many, of course, were Scots-Irish. If you look at the figures for those who've laid claim to Scots and/or Irish heritage, George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, not to mention the current incumbent, maybe we shouldn't mention the current, I don't know, but, and indeed the current incumbent's predecessor. So if we're looking for an indicator of the potential of our people, both here and abroad, I think that's not a bad reference point. And furthermore, of course, the two frontrunners in the current presidential race, John McCain and Barack Obama, can both trace their ancestry back to King William I. That is William the Lion, who ruled Scotland between 1165 and 1214, not King Billy, incidentally, just... Meanwhile, Hillary Rodham Clinton has Scottish, Welsh, and English blood, and not an insignificant Irish connection, I understand, through marriage. It's not a bad template of the global significance of our two countries. But let me look for a minute or two about Ireland's economic miracle. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because, not because I don't believe Ireland's success is a miracle, but it's entirely explicable. But I think there's a good chance that one or two of you here this evening already know a fair bit about the subject. There is no denying the extraordinary transformation in Ireland's economic and social prospects over the last 25 years. As late as 1986, Ireland's GDP per capita was 2/3 of the European Union's average. Today, if we took the EU 15 as was, it's around 130% of that average. Ireland stands fifth, crucially, in my view, in the United Nations Human Development Index, which includes a whole range of social and economic factors, not just a single GDP measure. Now, economic growth in Ireland may slip over the next year or two because of your exposure to global trade, but the long-term outlook is very strong. And I'm sure that most of Europe's current finance ministers would give an arm and a leg to have Ireland's policy problems rather than the ones that they have. Now, the Scottish experience over the same period has been rather different. It's not an account of abject failure. Our economy is not a basket case, but it is an economy which has a sustained underperformance. When the Scottish Government unveiled the economic strategy and the draft budget last November, we highlighted that Scottish growth over the last 30 years has averaged 1.8%. That is markedly slower than the UK average of 2.3%. It is around half of the rate of the nations in the arc of prosperity that I identified earlier. It's 1/3 of the more than 5% growth rate that Ireland has managed over the same period. Now, that poor growth rate has real consequences. It's not an abstract economic calculation. It has real consequences for real people. It's denied opportunity and prosperity to large numbers of Scottish citizens. It's diminished our international standing. It's weakened the source of the country's future strength for people or talent. And that's why the new Scottish Government's economic strategy identifies population growth as a major objective, because it paves the way for continued success. Ireland's population is now over 4 million for the first time since 1861. Ireland demonstrates that it's possible to create a virtuous economic cycle between economic and population growth. I remember some years ago going from County Mayo to Connemara over the road through the mountains, and I came across a cairn which I stopped at and had a look at the cairn. And it was a cairn, I think, from dating about 1890, 1895. And what interested me wasn't so much the cairn was the people who built the road. But it was the body which had organised the building that struck me. It said it was built under the authority of the Board for the Overpopulated Counties. The overpopulated counties. Maybe we've learned some lessons that it's not counties or countries that are overpopulated, it's countries which don't have the ability or the imagination or the power of the self-determination to make the land prosperous and the nation grow. But it is possible to have a virtuous cycle between economic and population growth. Now, I've spoken about the ties between our two countries and about Ireland's economic transformation. There are many conclusions that one can draw from your recent history, from the emergence and the continued success of the Celtic Tiger. But ultimately, only one question matters for Scotland. Are we capable of matching or even surpassing Ireland's success? And I want to put it to you this evening, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. You see, Ireland's success is not simply a one-off. It's not an accident of history and economics that can never be repeated. I and much of Scotland, an increasing amount of Scotland, I hope, see Ireland's success as the reward for continued hard work, for effort, for determination, for ambition, and of the success that comes when a country has the courage to take the opportunities that are available. So tonight, as Scotland considers its economic future and position as a country, let me outline the main lessons, the main inspirations that Scotland can draw from the success of Ireland. I've often heard it said in politics and publicity and propaganda and things that 3 is the magic number, that people are naturally receptive to a list of 3 items. And here at Trinity College, what could be more natural than obeying that particular law? But I'm Scottish, and we're thrawn. So I'm going to give you 10 lessons that Scotland, and indeed other nations, can draw from your history and take to heart in considering our own future. First, and most important, there are no limits to the success of a nation which can be united by a common purpose. Ireland provides an object lesson. It took a frank and profound discussion about the nature of Ireland's past economic and indeed educational underperformance and how best to remedy and address it. But that debate and that conclusion has been the foundations of sustained economic success. If we go back to the 1987 Economic Plan for Ireland, the plan which created your strong and enduring social partnership, the economic plan from '87 begins with the words, the government, the ICTU, the FUE, the CII, the CIF, the IFA, doesn't say anything about the CIA, but nonetheless, market firm and ICOS, conscious of the grave state of our economic and social life, have agreed on this programme to seek to regenerate our economy and improve the social equity of society through our combined efforts. It doesn't, for emotional pull, perhaps match the words of the Founding Fathers, but nonetheless it is a profound and important statement and platform for future success. The intent was strong, clear, and shared. Now in Scotland now, through our economic strategy, our new partnership with local government, and through the National Economic Forum, which we have established, we are seeking to build the same strong and lasting coalition among our institutions, and lay the foundations, therefore, for the same economic success as has been enjoyed by Ireland. I'm an economist, as was said by the chairman earlier on, and you know there are dozens of things you can do to make an economy successful, but only 2 things really matter. The 2 things that you must do, which are the prerequisites for success. One, you've got to educate your people, you've got to invest in human capital. If you don't do that, then. But secondly, you must have a comparative or competitive advantage or seek to find such a thing. If you merely invest in the people without the competitive advantage, then what you produce is the best educated airport departure lounges in the world. If you do both of these things, then you have the economic success that Ireland has enjoyed. If you do one of them, you muddle along like Scotland has been doing. We've done the first, incidentally, we've done the people bit. We do that very well. If you do neither, then you're heading for problems. Second point, it may surprise you, coming from Scotland's first SNP First Minister, but it is a really important point. Political independence of itself doesn't guarantee success. It's what you do with the independence that matters. Ireland's development up to the 1970s shows that without the right economic strategy, a relatively poor nation fell further behind relatively compared to other European countries. But with the right policies, and ones that are engaged with the global economy, the economic rewards are great for small European countries. Third lesson, particular reference to the history of Scotland and Ireland, let's never forget the counterfactual. While only Ireland has a recent experience of independence, we can both agree, I hope, that continued membership of the United Kingdom will guarantee underperformance. As I said earlier, Ireland now is somewhat 30% more prosperous than the EU average per head on GDP measurement, perhaps almost 40% more prosperous than the United Kingdom per head. Now, you can argue about GDP measurements, but the figures are something like that. I doubt if there's a single rational person on the face of this planet who would believe that if Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom, then the part of the United Kingdom in the western periphery would be 30 to 40% more prosperous than the average. No one would believe such a thing. So the counterfactual can sometimes be important in stressing points. Fourth point, the point I made slightly earlier, investment in human capital, education, skills, potential of the people, is the basic determinant of economic success. And the foundation, one of the foundations of Ireland's current success was the education and training reforms from the 1960s onwards. Now, Scotland has always placed great emphasis on education, the development of the individual, society and the economy. And my government is proud to be the one which restores the principle of free education to Scotland. Now, I know free education is a principle you hear hold dear in Ireland. Ireland, of course, abolished university tuition fees in the 1990s. But I do claim free education as a Scottish invention. It was the first social legislation, not the current Scottish Parliament, but of the old Scottish Parliament before 1707. In 1595, the legislation provided for a parish school. Incidentally, the first social legislation in England was the Poor Law, leading to the postulation that in Scotland you could starve, but you'd have to be educated. In England, you weren't allowed to starve, you could go to the poorhouse, but under no circumstances were you allowed to be educated just in case you got above yourself and did strange things. So it's an interesting historical contrast between the two countries. Free education is a Scottish invention. Incidentally, it's one of the reasons, probably the reason, that we invented all the other things as well. Without free education, we wouldn't have invented any of these things. I spoke about Robert Burns earlier. The point about Robert Burns as an artist, as a poet, as a brilliant cultural phenomena, is that Robert Burns was a peasant farmer living in late 18th century Scotland. In late 18th century Scotland, Burns wasn't a divinely inspired person who was ploughing a field when a bolt of lightning hit him on the head and he started to produce wonderful poetry. Burns was an educated man. Burns had been superbly well educated and tutored. And the point about Scotland is, in the late 18th century, the only country on earth, with the possible exception of Germany, where a peasant farmer would likely be educated was Scotland. That's why Robert Burns was Robert Burns. So it was a Scottish invention, but one which Ireland has adopted and taken and has been the cornerstone of your economic revival. Fifth, a simple point which applies as clearly to Scotland as it does to Ireland, the European Union is and will remain our most significant economic relationship. As recently as 1960, 3/4 of Ireland's exports were to the United Kingdom. Today the figure is less than 20%, marginally behind Ireland's exports to the United States. So while the UK remains a trading partner, a major trading partner, it should be seen as one among its peers in the European and global economy. Sixth, in Ireland, as in Denmark, Finland, Norway and Sweden, prosperity depends on openness and the development of comparative advantage. Ireland exports the greatest share of its output of all the European economies, but you're not complacent. The Irish Development Agency continues to watch the global economy for emerging technologies and commercial opportunities and makes sure that government and business take note. Government and business in Scotland must cooperate just as well if we are to succeed in the global economy. Seventh, a vital lesson, an expensive one to ignore, An economic windfall must be used wisely. During the 1980s and for a part of the 1990s, Ireland received a large inflow of European Union structural funds. Today, as a rich country within the European Union, that flow has stopped, as it would. It's even reversed. But it's widely accepted that of all Europe's states, Ireland made great use of its economic opportunity by investing heavily in education and training, strengthening the business environment to attract mobile capital. Contrast that with the United Kingdom, or more precisely Scotland, which benefited from a similar windfall in terms of GDP in the North Sea oil and gas. Since the late 1970s, these revenues have provided us with a great economic opportunity. Future generations will judge on how that's been used. With good management, there's perhaps 30 to 40 years of hydrocarbons in the North Sea, and because of peak oil, the value of these hydrocarbons is probably greater than the hydrocarbons extracted over the last 30 or 40. But if we want an example of how to manage a major natural resource, then we should look off our east coast in Scotland to Norway. The Norwegian government created first a fund for future generations, now called the Norwegian Pension Fund. It's not actually the pension fund, it's meant to express the national interest in building up an investment fund which now totals £170 billion, accumulated in 10 years, which is what, about £40,000 a head, 80, 70,000 euros or whatever, for every man, woman and child in Norway. And the importance of that is obvious. If you say to somebody in Norway, how long is your oil and gas going to last? The answer is forever, as long as that investment fund contributes to Norwegian prosperity. I would like the Scottish Government to be in a position to do the same. Eighth, a point to remember in pursuit of our ambition: economic growth creates its own challenges. Today, despite undoubted economic success, the Irish Government is wrestling with the consequences of inflation and house pricing, strained infrastructure, income inequality. Fast growth is not a panacea, though vitally it creates the potential for all of society to enjoy prosperity. The Scottish Government seeks to match the enviable growth record of Ireland, and we are prepared to work hard to maintain social justice, to renew the foundations of economic success. Ninth, moving away from the economy to the global picture, there are clear lessons from Scotland and Ireland and our neighbours in the Nordic countries. They are small, peaceful countries that exercise substantial global influence. And that influence, as Ireland itself demonstrates, can be based not on military power or indeed on alliances, but on values and ideals. Now consider your former president, Mary Robinson, a daughter of this university, who did such great work as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and today continues to champion development, human rights and the environment. In Europe, Charlie McCreevy holds one of the Commission's key portfolios, internal market and services. An Irishwoman, Catherine Day, is Europe's top civil servant, having replaced another Irishman and son of Trinity, David O'Sullivan. Peter Salmond, who I mentioned earlier, formerly head of the World Trade Organization, and now in his time away from the boards of BP and Goldman Sachs, the United Nations Special Representative on Migration. And equally, if not more influential, two Irish rock stars made good, Bob Geldof and Bono, both at the forefront of a historic campaign against global poverty, which has mobilized millions and hopefully will improve the lives of millions more. In Scotland, we aspire to exert a similar positive influence on the global stage. Across the world, Scots have a reputation for public service, for philanthropy, and today we strive to extend that positive influence by taking a global lead on climate change, on green energy. And boosted by the recognition of the international community through the award of the 2014 Commonwealth Games, we will go on to greater achievement. 10th, finally and last, let me draw an important lesson about the process of becoming a successful nation state. There is no exact blueprint for a transition to full national independence. Steps towards Irish independence were many. The pace of change was inexact. It took the Westminster Parliament 3 attempts to pass the Home Rule Bill, finally succeeding in 1914. Interrupted by the war, independence followed within a decade. But for more than 25 years after the Free State, Ireland was a dominion of the Empire. In the First Minister's residence in Edinburgh in Bute House, I have a silver tray, which I rather like because it was given to Ramsay MacDonald, Scottish-born Prime Minister, on the occasion of his 64th birthday by the Imperial Conference and the delegates thereof. And at the Imperial Conference were all the dominions of the Empire, including, for example, India, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Newfoundland, which of course was a separate dominion then, not part of Canada, and the Irish Free State. And the delegates' signatures are engraved on the silver tray. We often forget the steps and the process was many and several and different. Now, does that suggest that constitutional incrementalism is always the best approach? Mayor Robinson once memorably in Glasgow argued it was only once Ireland gained its independence and was able to debate and take full responsibility for its choices that it could possibly succeed as a nation. And then she said it was only when it was able to play a wider role on the global stage through membership of European stage that Ireland gained real independence. The independence was extended by membership of the European community. If we look across Europe just now to nations like Slovakia or Estonia, emerging from a communist past, we can see how a rapid transition to independence from even the most unpromising of circumstances can succeed. In fact, it can be a great source of energy and purpose. So in conclusion, these are the principal lessons I take from Ireland's development as a nation. These are the ways which the past and indeed the present day of this country will help to shape the future of Scotland. Above all, the Scottish Government draws a lesson about a unity of purpose among a nation, its people, its institutions, as the basis for economic and social success. I mentioned in my introduction that Scotland, a major debate is now underway in Scotland about our constitution, about our future ambition. And of course, we're not alone in that debate in these islands. In Wales and Northern Ireland, we see increasing desire for constitutional change, of different kinds, perhaps, but of some kind. In Cardiff, Plaid Cymru has now joined the government. In Belfast, we see day by day the growing strength and value of strong, stable, democratic institutions. And let me pay the warmest tribute to all of my colleagues in Northern Ireland, and in particular the First Minister and Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, for the manner in which they're approaching governance. Of all of these areas and nations, the debate in Scotland is most advanced, and it's long, long overdue. It was August last year, within our first 100 days as a government, that we outlined the first phase of the national conversation and published the white paper on Scotland's future. We believe that Scotland's constitutional future and its future as a nation is too important just to be left to politicians. What was needed was a more open discussion on the issues that matter to the people of Scotland, starting first by listening to the views. That is what we are doing and have been doing. And within that new and open form of engagement, the terms of political debate have changed and changed forever. A few months ago, well, less than a year ago, all the other main parties, with the exception of the Liberals, opposed any further constitutional change in Scotland. Now, in Scotland at least, they've concluded that the status quo is no longer an option. I understand there's still a few last-ditchers and diehards at Westminster, but there is a growing political consensus in Scotland. A consensus that a decade after devolution, we must look at the current settlement and see how it serves Scotland's best interests, particularly in relation to economic and fiscal powers. Now, I am delighted that the Scottish churches, the voluntary sector, our business community, our trade unions and our historic universities are all contributing to that conversation. We'll ensure that the people of Scotland are directly involved, because ultimately it is our citizens who will decide the form of constitutional change, so we must hear from them about the powers and responsibilities that Scotland needs for its parliament and its government. The stakes could not be clearer, and they are higher than many in Scotland realise. The rewards to a nation that is willing to face up to its position, set its ambition, pursue it resolutely, these rewards could scarcely be greater. The story of Ireland, one of the greatest success stories of the last century and of this century, is a testament to what peoples can achieve, what Scotland could achieve, if we are prepared to learn your lessons, if we are prepared to trust ourselves. If we doubt ourselves, we cannot succeed. But if we trust ourselves, we cannot fail. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.